Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Mess. So today we're going to continue the series on whatever the hell this might be, because it's both a MiSTer FPGA video as well as a review of the newest port from Infidelity, bringing Punch-Out from the Nintendo Entertainment System to the Super Nintendo. I heard about this, somebody from the MiSTer Discord let me know about it, and a few other people asked me to test it on MiSTer, so I figured two birds, one stone, amazing new port of a very popular game as well as a MiSTer FPGA test. Because obviously this is an NES game, but it's running within the Super Nintendo core, and this is Infidelity basically remaking the entire game to get it to function over on Super Nintendo. So even though this looks, plays, sounds, and feels like an NES game, it's a Super Nintendo game here today. And that is absolutely amazing. I love talking about modding work, and if you haven't recently watched, Infidelity just released this Mega Man 1 MSU port to Super Nintendo. I did a video on it, and I will leave a link in the description below. He is constantly making new things on the Nintendo side, and every single one of his projects is absolutely spectacular. It runs in software emulation on real hardware and here on MiSTer FPGA today. And I love that there's fans out there just going the extra mile to bring all of these ports into different hardware platforms. You're going to be basically getting the same sound experience compared to Mega Man, where he had a different soundtrack imported in, but I bet that this is just a start of different things that he can do with Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. And of course, this is the Mike Tyson variant you're not playing if you're not playing against Iron Mike. And honestly, this game is so incredibly difficult, even getting to Mike Tyson definitely takes a lot of practice. But the great part is the port here is flawless. There is no latency, there is no lag if you're on real hardware or MiSTer FPGA, so all of Infidelity's coding work to get this to work within Super Nintendo paid off, because you are going to fail or you're going to succeed based entirely on your own read of the situation and how fast you hit that controller. No latency, no lag means if you lose, it's your fault, not the game's whatsoever. And if you've never played Punch-Out before, somehow you will know that in later levels, you need to basically be frame perfect to dodge a lot of the different attacks that your opponents are going to be sending against you. But honestly, Glass Joe here, he's a free win every single time you play the game. But it's so wild to think that this can even be done in the first place. Porting an entire Nintendo game to the Super Nintendo with no changes, but also getting it to run on the Super Nintendo architecture is no easy feat. Sure, the Super Nintendo has all the hardware brute force to be able to play something like this because it is more powerful, but it executes a completely different type of code in a completely different type of way, has to deal with different mappers from the NES. It is a very big project to make something like this run flawlessly on Super Nintendo. And as the MiSTer portion of this video clearly shows, it is working here at FPGA too. This is incredible just to see and experience, and as long as your television has very little latency, sub-frame, on MiSTer FPGA you're going to be getting an absolute rock-solid performance experience out of this. All of your inputs are going to be to the frame, so all of that tight timing, especially if you ever make it to Iron Mike Tyson, is going to be essential, and you're going to get it here on MiSTer FPGA. But again, this is just such an iconic Nintendo game, and that's why these things get ported around. People grew up with stuff like this, they love it, they remember it, they know it, and they want to just play around with it. And honestly, as big of a Nintendo franchise as this is, it's not like Nintendo does a lot with Punch-Out. We're definitely due for a new game, and if any way that Nintendo would ever release a game off their hardware, I would pay for a VR version of Punch-Out any day of the week and twice on Sundays. That's how much fun it is, and I think this franchise would be incredible pivoted over towards VR. But of course, Nintendo's not going to do that, so it is just a pipe dream. But we'll see here as we go on to the next fight. Again, this is a Nintendo game running on Super Nintendo hardware, running within MiSTer FPGA. It's like 3 layers of abstraction deep, and it just 100% works. And it's very interesting to hear the music coming out and being so iconically recognizable on Super Nintendo as well. So go ahead and listen for like 35 seconds, and I'll come back and talk more about the port and why it matters. That might be some of the most iconic Nintendo music of its era, and I can still hum that in my head today, and it sounds incredible coming out of a Super Nintendo FPGA core, a Super Nintendo emulator, or real Super Nintendo hardware. And trust me, that is not an easy feat to take a Nintendo game, get it over to Super Nintendo as a port, and have it sound that perfect. It is just such a fun thing to see, and Infidelity has been doing this a long time. If you're not familiar with him, he has a ton of different hacks out there, different conversions, different MSU1 ROMs. There is a ton of fun to be played on his side, so I definitely recommend you check it out. And the best part is, within the download, he also included a lot of the different tests and documentations on how he got this done. So if you are curious about the technical aspect of how you port something like Punch-Out from the Nintendo Entertainment System to the Super Nintendo, he also provides you that learning experience. And for me at least, so much of the fun here is finding out how something is done and not just the end result. And if you're like me whatsoever, you'll get all of that additional documentation. But again, this is just insane. Seeing Punch-Out run in Super Nintendo, this is stuff that technically shouldn't work. Of course you can make it work, but that feeling of it not being right is just uncanny. This is a Nintendo game, we should be playing it in the NES core, not the Super Nintendo core, and that's where the fun lies. There's so many different things you can do now that this is working. You can put in a completely different soundtrack with MSU1 support. The sky really is the limit when it comes to projects like this, and that's why I always talk about them on the channel. It's not just fun to talk about new hardware like MiSTer cores, it's fun to talk about new software and new mods on the scene as well, because for the most part fans keep these things alive when companies like Nintendo would rather sue people for making emulators than ever go back into their back catalog and give you a new way to play a game you know, love, and remember. And this one is just a classic. I remember getting it back in the day when I was a kid. I loved it, I was terrible at it, and even to this day it takes me hours of practice to even get anywhere near Mike Tyson, and that's one of those things. It's a very big accomplishment if you actually beat the champ, because it is probably one of the hardest things you can do on Nintendo. And tell me down below if you've ever beaten Mike Tyson. I would be very curious. I'm assuming most of you probably have not. And don't forget that they did lose the license to use Mike Tyson in the game apparently, so they pivoted to just Punch-Out with Mr. Dream. So maybe you beat Mr. Dream and not Mike Tyson. But either way, if you want to play this game, you want to play it with the Mike Tyson version. That is the only way to play. And if you can't tell already, the health bar is down at the bottom of the screen. That is a change, but a really interesting one as well. But honestly, again, this is just the type of stuff that's so much fun to talk about. All of these new fan projects just bring so much more life to what we played before. And this was basically a test to see if they could get a certain mapper over to the Super Nintendo, because a lot of the Nintendo games use specific mappers and some of them can be more difficult to deal with than the others. And I'm sure that heads-up display will come to the top of the screen at some point in time, but honestly I really don't mind it at the bottom. But leave me a comment down below and tell me what you think. But again, this is just so much fun. I love stuff like this, and I love being able to test it on MiSTer FPGA, because you do want to make sure that all of this stuff works on cores when it is trying to replicate original hardware. But honestly, this video is just for fun, to show you guys something new and unique that is happening. When these things happen, a lot of people contact me. I get excited about making videos, and I hope you enjoy watching them, because I love new innovations in retro content. Because if we were just left to what we had before and nobody made anything new, it would still be a fun time, but honestly wouldn't have near as much fun as we would with stuff like this. And even just in the intro rounds here, I am already struggling to dodge stuff, not because there's any latency in the core whatsoever, just because Punch-Out is an incredibly difficult game, but it's also an incredibly fun game. If you've never played it before somehow, this is an awesome way to check it out. But however you play it, definitely play Punch-Out, and tell me down below if you had the game back in the day, because I feel like anyone who had an NES when it was on the market definitely had a copy of Punch-Out, whether it was the Mike Tyson version or if it was a version with Mr. Dream. And you'll see there I have been knocked down to the canvas, and that's going to happen to you a lot in this game. And when you lose, you're going to get pushed back a match as well, and it is going to be very difficult to see the end. And this is the type of game that is just pure challenge, but the first time you finally beat it, the sense of accomplishment is going to be outstanding, and the fact that it works here today on MiSTer FPGA on the Super Nintendo core is absolutely wild. But short of that, that's the news. Mike Tyson's Punch-Out is now on Super Nintendo, and it works on MiSTer FPGA. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below, and I will leave a link to Infidelity's Twitter as well, so you guys can go ahead and check this out yourself. But short of that, I am done. Little Mac here, who's apparently 17 per the specs, don't know who let a minor fight, is going to fight this gigantic man in front of him and probably get knocked out. But I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.